Hey, it's Andryanna, and we're back for another episode of the Juggle is Real podcast. And today's guest is someone that I've been really looking forward to speaking with. We've got Rachelle Bergstein, who is a bestselling author, a journalist, editor, and pop culture observer who spent the last 2 decades writing about style, families, and cultural history in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, Forbes, and many more. She's also been a feature editor for the New York Post and has appeared on NPR's Weekend Edition, WSJ Lunch Break, and Yahoo Finance. Her latest book, The Genius of Judy: How Judy Blume Rewrote Childhood for All of Us, is a USA Today bestseller with good reason. It's been called groundbreaking, lively, and important, and it explores the cultural impact of one of the most banned authors in history. It also shines a light on how Bloom's honesty changed generations and why her stories still matter so much today, especially for moms, educators, and really anyone raising emotionally complex kids in a politically complex world. In our conversation today, we are talking about career and motherhood, the stories that shape us, book banning, and why embracing imperfection might just be our greatest power. This episode is for you if you grew up reading Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. If you've ever second guessed how much truth to share with your kids or in public, or if you're wondering how to protect their curiosity in a world that wants to shut it down. Let's dive right in.
This is the Juggle is Real podcast. I hope you feel seen, that you realize your worth, lighten your load, and prioritize your own needs. As we hear from leading experts and well-known faces in the wellness, entrepreneurship, education, and motherhood space, I hope you gain insights, proven practices, and learn actionable tools to help you enjoy the juggle of work, family, and everything in between with a little less stress and a lot more ease, joy, and fun. Most of all, I hope you find what you need to simplify, streamline, and supercharge your own journey of better balance and self-love. Are you with me? Let's get started.
Rachelle, welcome to The Juggle is Real. I'm really excited to chat with you today. How are you?
I am good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you too.
It's funny because a lot of things have been coming up for me just, I've been reading your book and I've been thinking to my childhood and those sort of middle years and hitting puberty and my adolescence. And so I would just love to start with Judy, of course, and I want to talk about your why because I think um, for me, I definitely read Judy Blume's books. I definitely was also into things like Babysitter's Club and, Ramona P. Quimby and even Goosebumps. And I'm going to age myself, and you'll probably guess my age based on those books. But I know that for you, Judy Blume really was a strong presence in your early years and growing up as well. So, what drew you to Judy Blume as a subject to write on? I know you've written about shoes and diamonds, and now this legendary author. So, why this story? Why did you think it was a great time to write it right now? And I just love to know: was it personal for you, political, a little bit of both? Tell me that why.
Yeah, those are great questions. It was definitely a mixture of both. Personally, I really love Judy Blume. I write about in my book how meaningful she was to me as a child and how drawn into her books I was immediately when I found them in my home. And when I say found them, I didn't really buy Judy Blume's books. They kind of arrived at my door in that I had a single mom. She had a close friend with two older daughters, and she would hand down a bunch of stuff to us, like clothes, shoes, bathing suits, books. And among those books were the Judy Blume books that I ended up reading just because I read everything that anyone put in front of me. Um, so certainly there was a personal connection. There was also a question of timing, which was I was starting to notice that so many women around my age, I'm 43, give or take, um, we're starting to look back on their experiences of reading Judy Blume with such incredible fondness and respect for her and her work, admiration, almost like they had known her personally. Um, and then finally, when I started this project, it was during Trump's first presidency. Roe v. Wade was overturned while I was writing the book proposal. So I felt a certain
Mm.
urgency around women's bodily autonomy that I think is very subtly reflected in Judy's work. And that was an aspect that I wanted to draw out when I was writing about her.
So interesting because, as you said it, the thoughts and the feelings that were brought up for me when this book came across in my life, your book, The Genius of Judy, thinking back to that time, because I don't believe when you're in it, you don't really understand, how complex those topics are. You're in it and it feels very real and it feels very raw. But when you have some perspective and you can go back, I mean, it's made me want to go back and read those books and kind of feel like, how did I feel then and what has changed and what do I know now? Having that distance between it. But what struck me as really interesting was that Judy Blume started writing as a young mom, craving purpose. And in the beginning of your book, you go through Judy's life and how she sort of went through the motions of doing what she thought she should do, by the way of getting married and moving to the suburbs and having children. And you note that even though she went to college, her mom would have been just mortified if she actually used her education and got a job and had a career. And I mean, things have changed since she went through the motions, but in many ways, her story mirrors that of so many women today. And Judy found her voice in the chaos of early motherhood. So, can you speak to how that experience shaped her writing and why it feels, I would say, really relevant for moms today who are trying to do that juggle? They're balancing their own ambition and their creativity, but they're also in this stage of navigating motherhood. They're caregivers, and there's a lot on the plate. So, can you speak to that and how it supported Judy at that time of her life?
Absolutely. So, like you said, Judy Blume, she was born into a regular middle class family. She spent the bulk of her childhood during the 1950s, and she was raised with really specific values, which were um, whether or not you were an intelligent girl with a lot of creativity. What your purpose was in life was to find a provider in a husband and have children pretty young. And that's exactly what she did. So she went to college, but she was married and pregnant by the time she graduated. And she and her husband moved to a lovely home in suburban New Jersey. She had two kids by her mid 20s. And on paper, she had a really great life. They had money, they had great kids, they had a perfectly nice marriage, as she describes it. Um, but she was miserable. And that
Mm-hmm.
misery was not just psychological, it was manifesting in all sorts of physical ways. She was sick all the time. She was in bed with headaches, sore throats, dizziness, rashes, weird maladies that the doctor couldn't explain. And after her children went to elementary school, she started to realize, I was a very creative kid. Um, she took dance lessons, she made up stories, she was on the staff of the high school yearbook, she did plays, and all of that stuff had just evaporated from her life. So, one of the reasons she started writing, I would say the major reason she started writing, is because she was just looking for a creative outlet. She was trying to find ways to express herself that didn't interfere with her roles as caregiver and wife. So she has said in interviews, her husband really didn't mind when she started writing as long as she had dinner on the table every night. Writing was something
Sure.
that she could do for relatively no money. She needed pencils and paper, and she could do it while her kids were in school. So I think, like many of us who are parents, even in 2025, we're all looking for ways to sort of balance, if that such a thing is possible, um, our roles as daughters, wives, parents, and also professional people. So, Judy was just doing what all of us, I think, are doing, which was trying to find ways to make it all fit together. And it just turned out she had a real talent for writing for children.
I think I heard a saying, and I'm not going to say it exactly, but it's something along the lines of many of us were not feeling burnt out because we're doing too much, but we feel burnt out because we're not doing enough of the things that truly light us up. And I think we can see it in a lot of ways through Judy, as you described, through the ailments, the illnesses. And then once she was able to tap into that spark, then she truly was able to lean into her purpose and, be able to, like you said, put dinner on the table, but really do something that felt meaningful for her. You described Judy Blume's work as deceptively simple, but revolutionary. And today, I think in our world, today's world is really just this carefully curated parenting place where we have so much pressure on us to perform. Um, I would love to know, what do you think we can learn as parents about her unapologetic honesty? Like, did anything surprise you while you were researching her for this book? And I'd just love to know how it has shaped you as, with your own voice, as a writer, as a mom, as, a person trying to wear many hats.
What surprised me about her story was that because I was a child of the 80s and 90s, in my mind, Judy Blume had always been successful. She had always been kind of a cultural icon. And that really wasn't the case. When she started writing, she, like everybody else, had to work at it. She was rejected a lot. Um, the literary critics, when she started publishing, were not very impressed with her. So it was an uphill climb, and it was a matter of believing in herself, believing in what she was doing, finding the right allies in the publishing world, in her editor, Dick Jackson, and her publisher, Bradbury Press. Um, so I was very inspired. I actually found her story more inspiring because she had struggled and because she had to work to carve out the life that she wanted, that it wasn't served to her. And I mean, I think that's something, as you said, that we're all dealing with, right? It's like, how do you nurture that spark that many of us identify as children, as creative children? And how do you hold on to it when the world wants you to give in so many different ways, whether it's um, as a mother, because parenting has gotten only more labor intensive, or in your job to make money, that's not always the most creatively nurturing place. So how do we find ways to continue to delight in what we're doing? And I think that's a struggle that every woman I know and many men I know are still working out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think too, um, you know, knowing that she didn't have a perfect journey can be that motivation for someone reading your book to be like, okay, well, then maybe I can do it too.
Hmm.
Wherever I'm at, no matter what age I am, no matter where I am in my career or how old my children are, like I can start something as long as as long as it's giving me that spark. And it doesn't necessarily have to become super successful or make a lot of money, but like you're tapping into something regardless of, where it's going to go, as long as it's, feeding that spark within you, which is, I think, like a beautiful theme that I'm taking away for sure. Um, One of the reasons Judy's books has really struck a chord, I feel, is because she didn't talk down to the readers. You talk about a lot of those books at the time really skirted around subjects. Even, you talk about sex education actually entering schools, and the language that was used was still, very plain, very medical, didn't really describe a lot of what was happening. But Judy didn't talk down to young readers. She gave them credit for being, complex humans, whatever age they were. She didn't shy away from some of those taboo topics, things like puberty and menstruation, bullying, even divorce. And you write that she wasn't really trying to be political. She wasn't there to make a stand and like make a big splash, but she just wanted to be truthful in her storytelling. Um, Unfortunately, when you're being honest and truth telling, especially when we're talking about our bodies and sex and our feelings and emotions, it makes people uncomfortable. And so I want to talk about censorship in a minute, but what can Judy's perspective and her resilience and that honesty teach us today?
Well, yeah, I think that Judy did not set out to be a revolutionary writer, and that's what's so interesting about her story. It's like one of her great talents was channeling her younger self and writing for that Judy. She wrote the books that she felt that she needed growing up or that her kids might need. And in doing so, she spoke to generations of people. I mean, it really is very inspiring. So I think there is something to be said for being honest with yourself. I mean, that's actually a harder process than it sounds like, right? And
Mhm.
actually doing the thing that you most believe in, and then worrying about finding the audience or finding the success leader. You know, even Judy Blume did not set out to be Judy Blume, right? She set out to be someone who was publishing and writing and finding some satisfaction in that. You know, she didn't look to take over the world with her work. She didn't look to change the world with her work. She just was doing what she believed in. And I think that having that kind of North Star is really something that we can all look up to and learn from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I did allude to it because, we can't talk about Judy Blume without talking about censorship. And I didn't realize this, but she was the most banned author in the US in the 1980s. I didn't know that, but I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense in a way. We're also seeing quite a resurgence of book banning right now here today, which I also didn't really realize either. What do you think Judy would say about this moment? And I'd love to know how you're continuing that advocacy through your Substack, which is called Banner Year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to guess what Judy would say because she's been quite vocal about this current moment. Judy was the most banned writer for a certain time in the 1980s. It wasn't one book in particular that made her the most banned. It was the sheer number of her catalog that was being banned at once. And
Mm,
it really took her off guard because many of the books that were banned in the 1980s had actually been out for 5, 10 years, right? So if you look at Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, it published in 1970. It spoke frankly about menstruation, about puberty. And it wasn't until the early 1980s that people started challenging that book and saying it wasn't good for kids to read. So she was really taken aback. She was really despondent. And for a time, she really let it get under her skin, this feeling that, wow, like I thought I was doing something good for kids and people are saying that I'm harming them. That was really painful for her. Um, she ended up connecting with an organization called the National Coalition Against Censorship. And that was an offshoot of the ACLU, which still exists today. And through that organization, she found her voice yet again as a pioneer against censorship. She has been very vocal that she thinks any sort of book removals when it comes to children are harmful. And she continues to say that now. The book banning crisis that we're facing now is a little bit different than the one in the 1980s. In the 1980s, it was mostly driven by grassroots groups. So I'm thinking of groups like the Moral Majority, like Phyllis Schlafly's The Eagle Forum. These were conservative groups that had a script. Phyllis Schlafly actually circulated a pamphlet called "How to Rid Your Books, Your Children's Schools and Libraries of Judy Blume." Um, but now it's the politicians themselves that are driving this. So it's not just people on the ground, it's people in office saying that we want to remove books from schools and libraries. So I'm thinking of Florida. That was kind of the canary in the coal mine for what's going on countrywide now. And it is dangerous. It is scary. And I was very inspired by Judy when I was writing this book, and I started keeping, as you said, a Substack called Banner Year about the crisis that we're seeing. So um, I'm personally tracking it. I'm involved with an organization called Authors Against Book Bans that are doing a lot of incredible on the ground work to prevent books from being removed from schools and libraries. And, it's a fight that I think all of us as citizens have a responsibility to take on because getting information to children is never harmful. And that's Judy's stance, and that has become my stance as well.
and thank you for doing that. I think it's great to see people like yourself who are taking a stand and who are, being really vocal about it. I'm Canadian, I'm in Canada. So we certainly hear a lot about what's happening in the US, and it most certainly affects everything that's happening in Canada as well. And, the last few years, we've been managing, this meta ban where, news outlets cannot post to Facebook and Instagram and Threads. And it's caused a lot of problems, and a lot of communication that could easily be released is now much more difficult to do. And so I think we're seeing it, whether it's book bans, whether it's, censorship in the media, whether, there's a lot of different themes that I think we really have to speak up for and stand up for today. So I appreciate what you're doing. And there is a really beautiful thread in your book about the power of being misunderstood and still going out and writing and speaking and creating and using your voice in whatever way is, best suited for you. So how do we, in your opinion, hold on to our values and our voice, even when they don't fit the mold, even when it's going against the grain? Maybe you can tie this into women who are, kind of at that identity crisis with motherhood and trying to find that spark again.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, first of all. I think again, it's about staying true to your belief system and finding community in that. Whether it's living in a community that reflects your ideals or connecting to people who are representing the minority voice, but who are willing to stand up to the more powerful. Um, I think all of that is really effective. And I think one of the things that makes Judy Blume's writing so, I think, powerful for young people is that she was really able to connect to that experience of finding your voice in your early adolescence, right? Looking around you and saying, okay, I don't necessarily agree with everything I see happening. And even though I'm only 11 years old, and even though my parents are supposed to know best, um, there are things that make me an individual that I am going to express no matter the consequences. And I think that's still a really terrific message for children. And I think it's one that Judy was able to imbue with so much realism because she herself, as an older person, was still experiencing it in a way. She has talked a lot about her relationship with her mother, how she felt she internalized a lot of the needs her mother had kind of placed on her to be a traditional happy housewife. And Judy had to break free of that. And I think a lot of us are always in the process of evolving, always in the process of breaking free from whatever programming we grew up with, whatever needs or, yeah, whatever our community is asking of us. I think that is an ongoing, lifelong process and one that it benefits us to stay in touch with before we lose ourselves.
Yeah, that's so true. I'm just thinking, a lot of this programming has been, put upon us, as you mentioned. A lot of it is really unconscious as well. Like if we may not have been told, like, you should do this or you should, like Judy's mom, expected of her. And maybe she was more vocal about this is what a good woman, wife, mother, etc. should do. I just think a lot of what we are programmed with today has been passed on almost unconsciously or through society. And we don't realize that we are just, continuing and perpetuating the same cycle while, feeling within like we're missing something, And so breaking free from something that we're not consciously doing, I think can be really challenging. So in reading something like your book, The Genius of Judy, or even going back to those books and being like, okay, what is my truth? Or what was it that I wanted to do? Or what is it that I want to do now? And asking ourselves those questions. I mean, I feel like so many of us don't even ask, what do I need?
Hmm.
We're so busy thinking about what everyone else needs or what everyone else thinks we should want and do. So, really just coming back to asking ourselves those very simple questions, but truly listening to what the answers are. I mean, you for yourself, um, of course, you've been navigating what we call the juggle as a mother, a journalist, a writer, also a breast cancer survivor. So, in your words, can you share what this book has taught you about motherhood in your experience, about your own creative work, about your own healing process and what you've had to go through in your life, and how you define yourself through all of it?
So I actually wrote a lot of this manuscript while I was in treatment for breast cancer. And when I tell people that, they're really shocked, like how could you possibly have managed that? And I always say the same thing, which is that it really helped me get through the worst of treatment. Um, I did have to have chemo, I had radiation, I had hormone therapy. I mean, they've really thrown everything at me that they possibly can. And working on this book while I was in the thick of it, it actually gave me a sense of purpose and it distracted me and it gave me something to, roll up my sleeves and do while a lot of things that I couldn't control were happening to me. So I think all of that is to say it only reinforced how important it is to me to have this kind of creative output in my life, to have a space for my own intellectual needs and freedom, um, despite whatever is going on with my body, despite whatever is going on externally. I love being a parent. I love being a mom too. I have a 9-year-old son. Um, but having my own work and my own creative life has only enhanced my parenting. And that's been something I've needed to learn. No one goes into motherhood for the first time knowing exactly what it's going to look like, knowing exactly what it's going to feel like. And feeling entitled to that creative life has been a process for me and one that I think is really important.
Any advice for the listener who would love to make their own creative life more of a priority, but is struggling with it? Um, Struggling with just the notion of all the hats they're wearing and all the things they're carrying, and are worried about what that might make them seem like.
Yeah, so I think that it can feel really overwhelming to try to take on a huge project or to say, I'm going to make myself a writer or a painter or whatever it is that the listener's creative dream is. And I really think it's all about taking small bites or dipping a toe in the water or whatever, metaphor you want to use. It's really about just like trying it, not putting too much expectation on it. That can be difficult, right? You start writing a novel and you think like you want to tell yourself, well, this is going to be great and everybody's going to read it. But I think keeping those expectations in check is actually a really important practice, and just saying, I'm doing this for myself. We'll see what happens. I'm doing it today. I don't know if I'm going to do it tomorrow. Um, I've had people tell me, they feel really overwhelmed by the idea that if you want to be a writer, you have to write every day. And I say, then don't, then write when you can.
Mm-hmm.
Find those pockets, find what feels good for you. Because it is in the end about what feels good. And it isn't necessarily about success or money or whatever. It's about that satisfaction of knowing that you're doing something that gives you purpose and joy, and worry about the rest later.
Mm-hmm. So start small and release some of that pressure.
Yeah.
We don't have to put everything on a pedestal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that so much. What's your hope for readers who pick up the genius of Judy? What do you hope listeners, especially women, moms, take away from Judy's legacy and your work?
I hope that they understand a little bit more about the importance of what Judy Blume was doing in her work. I hope that women who grew up loving Judy Blume can read my book and feel like they understand a little bit better why they loved her so much. I hope that readers feel a little bit more empowered around giving children sex education and letting them read the things that they're interested in reading. Um, I think I spoke to so many librarians and teachers and sex educators for this project, and they all said the same thing, which is that information can only help children. Sex education, especially in this world where there's so much sexual content available in the world, in the ether, on billboards, on television, on the internet, you know, giving them the tools to decipher what all of that stuff means from an early age can only protect them. So that is my little bit of advocacy that I put into the book. Um, and yeah, I hope they enjoy it because I wanted this book to also be a little hat tip to Judy Blume, and that I wanted it to be easy reading. I wanted it to be fun. I wanted it to give people joy. So that's just a small list of the things that I hope people take away from this book. I always want to educate in my writing, but I also want to give people pleasure and for it to be fun. So that's what I strive for.
Well, I say I have not finished your book yet, but I'm about halfway through and I've really, really been enjoying it, both from just that historical perspective of going through that time and how things played out, and then being able to look to today and see how a lot of these themes are still mirrored in our everyday life. It's been really, really interesting. So you've definitely hit the nail on the head there, Rachelle. You mentioned you have a 9-year-old son. I have 3 boys. I have a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And so, I've noticed my 10-year-old is kind of, just like testing and saying things that he doesn't quite know what it means, but he's heard those words. And I was recently listening to a podcast, and it was comedy. It was Conan O'Brien with Mike Birbiglia, but they were talking about this latest Netflix special that he was promoting, and he was asking them, like, did you have the talk? Like the sex talk when you were a kid. And they were both like, no, like absolutely not. And all of, Conan's people in the room were like, no, we didn't get the talk. So did you do a talk with your son, or have you yet? You mentioned he's 9 years old. Or are there resources that you found through your research that you think could be helpful to share with children today? Maybe there are newer versions of books that could help adolescent, girls or boys that, are curious, but, a lot of that toxic masculinity is still very present today. Anything that you found or advice that you could share about having those conversations and giving children, the knowledge that they're so desperately craving?
So I really love the books by Corey Silverberg. I interviewed them for this project, and they have 2 books called Sex is a Funny Word, which is more kind of like geared towards a younger reader, so maybe 8-ish. And then Sex, which is more like 9, 10, 11. And they both are about sex education and body parts and puberty and those things, but they're also just about being a person in the world. And they're illustrated with these great cartoons, which I don't know about your kids, but my son really loves graphic novels. So it kind of fit into the zone for him. And it's really about being respectful of your peers and bodily autonomy and respecting your peers' differences, whether that's race, ethnicity, whether it's sexuality. There are so many things about sex education that just dovetail with how to be a person in the world. And I think that Corey Silverberg really nails that. And I know my son loves those books because they answer the really obvious questions about our bodies and how they work. But they also answer some questions that I think kids don't necessarily know how to ask, which is like, how do I relate to other people? How do I treat people with respect? What kind of respect should I be asking for? And I think that is kind of a subtle part about sex education that we don't really talk about, that it's about sex, but it's also about relationships.
Corey Silverberg. Okay, I'm definitely writing that down, and we'll take a look. And I'll throw some links in the notes for this podcast episode so that the listener can go check it out as well. And speaking of links, I've really enjoyed our conversation. For those of us who want to stay in touch and follow your work and see what you're up to, where's the best place to find you?
Readers can find me on my website. It's my full name, RachelleBergstein.com. I'm on Instagram at RachelleWB. We mentioned my Substack banner year. I love hearing from readers. I'm always excited to see my book tagged on Instagram, so please do reach out.
And are you working on anything new now?
Yeah, so speaking of the juggle, I think one of the things that people don't necessarily know about writers and people who write full time is that it is very much a juggle of different projects. I'm a journalist. I do freelance editing. I do some ghostwriting. So I'm kind of focusing on that end of my career right now. I'm kind of in a palate cleanse where I want to, make a little money and give myself some time to come up with new ideas. So I am doing all of that. I'm working on a lifestyle piece for the Washington Post about Botox, which should come out in early July. And yeah, I don't know what my next big project is, but I've been reading a lot of second, third wave feminism, kind of like on that border, and trying to figure out what I want to do with it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you
here.
so much for being here. I've really enjoyed this
Me
conversation.
too. Thank you so much for having me.
I loved that conversation and learning from Rachelle. And we did have a little bit of technical difficulties there at the end, but I think, truly what she's doing with her work and mirroring just the genius of Judy, just like her book title, I think it's so beautiful. I definitely invite you to go ahead and pick up that book, or have a listen on Audible or whatever is best for you, because I think you'll really, really enjoy it. And I am including some links in the notes for this podcast episode, so you can go ahead and check that out. A couple takeaways that really I'm leaving this conversation with is that you don't have to be perfect or, palatable or, doing what you should to make a powerful impact. And I think quite the opposite, right? When you are leading with imperfection and telling your truth and being honest, that is what really has the impact, which leads into that honest storytelling. And when it's coming from women and moms and people like us who are in the juggle, that is what's going to shift culture. That's what's going to make real change. And so the books that we read and the books that we write can really shape our entire lives, whether that's something that we read in our childhood, in our adolescence, something that we're going to pick up today. It can really make that shift and break us out of that box and maybe shift that programming like Rachelle was talking about today. So I urge you to go pick it up because it's never just about a book, right? We're talking about the censorship or the book ban or the media issues with Meta, like fighting for the freedom to read and speak truthfully. It really is important and essential work. So thank you so much to Rachelle for being here and for doing that very important work. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to please share with someone, post it, on your Facebook or Instagram, tag me in your stories. I'm at Andryanna G on Instagram. That's ANDRYANNAG. Make sure that you're subscribed. If you could rate this episode, write me a short and sweet review, and maybe have a conversation with someone, maybe a woman in your life who feels like she has to hold it all together, and let her know that she can, just drop that weight for a moment. Thank you so much for being here. I am so truly, truly grateful to have you join The Juggle is Real. Can't wait to see you here next time. Until then, take good care.